Good afternoon. My name is Sawika Colbert. I am the interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Georgetown University and the Idle Family Professor of African American Studies and Performing Arts. It's my great pleasure to moderate this session about slavery and the arts. I'm going to be joined by an amazing panel of guests. I will introduce them, and following the introductions, we will have a moderated discussion. But we also would love to hear from you and hear questions from our audience. So please type questions into the Q&A function on the bottom right of your screen, and we will integrate them into our conversation. Our first guest is Anita Gonzalez. Anita Gonzalez will be joining the faculty of Georgetown University as professor and co-founder of the Racial Justice Institute in the summer of 2021. She was recently Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and a professor of theater at the University of Michigan, where she promoted interdisciplinary and intercultural performance initiatives. Her edited and authored books are Performance, Dance, and Political Economy, Black Performance Theory, Afro-Mexico Dancing Between Myth and Reality, and Jericho's Soul. Gonzalez extends the reach of her scholarship through public engagement, directing, and playwriting. Her massive open online course, Storytelling for Social Change, has reached 40,000 listeners to date. A new open access course, Black Performance at Social Protest, will be released in June on the Future Learn digital platform. Our second guest is Melisandre Colon. Melly began her relationship with Georgetown University in 2017 as a descendant of two families enslaved and then sold by the Society of Jesus in 1838 to ensure the solvency of the institution. Under the direction of Derek Goldman, Melly has written, developed, and performed her one-person show, Here I Am, which I believe is available to all of our guests via the conference page. And I also encourage all of our guests, if you haven't had a chance to watch this show, to do so. Melly serves on the board of advisors for the Georgetown Memory Project, is a founding council member of the GU 272 Descendants Association, and was on the GU 272 advocacy team. Her talks vary from testimony before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to speaking at the Brooklyn Historical Society to a TEDx talk. Melly has been featured in print outlets from the Washington Post and the New Yorker to the AARP Journal. Our final guest is Carlos Simon. Simon is a composer and native of Atlanta, Georgia, whose music ranges from concert music for large and small ensembles to film scores with influences of jazz, gospel, and neo-romanticism. Simon was named as one of the recipients for the 2021 Sphinx Medal of Excellence. His latest album, My Ancestor's Gift, incorporates spoken word and historic recordings to craft a multifaceted program of musical works that are inspired as much by the past as they are the present. As part of the Sundance Institute, Simon was named as a Sundance Time Warner Composer Fellow in 2018. His string quartet Elegy, honoring the lives of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Eric Gardner, was recently performed at the Kennedy Center. Acting as music director and keyboardist for Grammy Award winner Jennifer Holliday, Simon has performed with the Boston Pop Symphony, Jackson Symphony, and St. Louis Symphony. He has toured internationally with Soul Grammy-nominated artist Angie Stone and performed throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. Most recently, Simon was named composer in residence at the Kennedy Center. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to our panelists, a warm virtual welcome. So I want to begin by saying that there are longer versions of our panelists' great accomplishments in their bios on the website, but I just gave you a small snippet of the work that they've done because I know we all want to jump into the conversation. And so I want to begin by asking if each of you could talk a little bit about how your work engages with the history and legacy of slavery, and if you wouldn't mind giving us a specific piece of work to serve as the anchor for our conversation. So an example of the work, of a piece of your work that engages with the histories and legacies of slavery, and perhaps we could begin with Anita.
Thank you, Sayika. Thank you, Dr. Colbert. So I was thinking that histories of slavery inform my work because they've impacted my family and they're part of the history of my bloodline. I write and direct stories about Black women because I come from a matriarchal family, and the strong women of my once enslaved ancestors inform my art making. I think of myself as coming from two different cultures of enslavement: the British Caribbean culture, because my grandmother was from the Bahamas, and the American South, because my other grandmother was from Lawrence, South Carolina. Um, so I write plays and musicals about individuals who are searching for roots and identities that are complicated because within the Black experience, it's a history of enslavement. So I'm particularly interested in the way women are trying to find their own self-esteem despite the humiliations that have happened in slavery and its aftermaths. So I'm working on this piece currently, a chamber musical called Zora on My Mind, and it's not about Zora. It's about a woman from Washington, D.C., who does domestic service while trying to run a business as a beautician. In the beginning of the play, she's about a woman who Zora would want to be after having survived the histories of the South and enslavement. So this woman, who's the central character of the play, has to sacrifice for her family in order to get ahead. I just want to comment, I saw Melly's show last night, and she was also talking about how it is that what do you give up when you have to decide between your children and moving on or your own life. And I think this woman is also facing that kind of a dilemma. So she has to survive on her own terms despite the legacies of slavery and trauma.
Thank you. That's a really powerful thread that you bring up that I hope we can return to in terms of a question around sacrifice and how what you let go of and what you hold on to as we engage the histories and legacies of slavery. Melly, would you please describe, I think that your work at Georgetown, the history that you've had is a testament to your engagement with the histories and legacies of slavery. But I wonder if there's a specific piece of that that you could highlight for our audience to give us an insight into some of your work.
Thank you, Dr. Colbert. Yes, and that did not come from Georgetown or my engagement with Georgetown. That actually came from a very long tradition of the oral history of my family that survived through 11 generations of our experience as Americans through colonial times and right up to the information that became world public information with the disclosure of the Jesuits' human trafficking practices. So I grew up in a family. My grandmother was the second generation born past slavery, and she was born into a family who were young people under the age of 18 in 1838. Those were her family members. And I grew up hearing her stories of her family. And I actually thought that every Black American family or American family had this rich tradition of an oral history and an acceptance of who we are and our place as Americans. And growing up in segregated New Orleans, in segregated America, in the South, in the New World, our collective history is art. It is a story. It is a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth knowing, worth sharing. And people who cannot connect with that, or those stories do not resonate with, is not reflective on us, who are the storytellers and the information givers. It is reflective of the blocks that exist in them.
Thank you. That's really powerful. And it goes some to the modes and the forms that storytelling can also take, both how it's translated to your artistic work, but then also how it's drawing from, as you eloquently described, a longer history of storytelling within your family and within the Black diasporic tradition. Carlos, how about you? What is some of the ways that slavery has informed your work?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Colbert. It's an honor to be here. I am, gosh, in the lineage of four preachers, four generations of preachers. Dating back almost 100 years. And you think about African American preachers and the African American community. They are pretty much pillars, and my work always sort of goes, it's embedded in this tradition of religion and spirituality in our community, and the history of what that brings. And I use music as a platform to tell these stories through my music in whatever form. It could be through orchestral means or something that is smaller and like chamber works. With this project that I'm embarked on as a recent hire at Georgetown. This is my second year as a faculty member, and I've wanted to be a part of the conversation that the university is having around its role in slavery, and I wanted to write a piece and thinking about going back to the religious aspect of Georgetown community and Jesuit community, as well as the African American community. One particular musical structure that stood out to me is the Requiem, which is a mass for the dead. And thinking about the musical traditions, a mass is something that is steeped in the Roman Catholic Church. And so I've decided to use this form as a means of honoring the enslaved and to pay homage to their legacy. Composers like Mozart and Beethoven and Gabriel Fauré have used this form, but I am choosing to use a form in a way that honors a rich part of my history as an African American man and the history of Georgetown. And so I approach the piece with reverence and sincerity.
I appreciate that. I've been contemplating a lot how our current moment calls forth new performance traditions to deal with the loss and the grieving that the pandemic and racialized violence has produced. And so the idea of Requiem is really powerful, I think, both in the context of remembering slavery, but also in the ongoing conditions that we live through. I love the fact that all of you reference familial tradition in describing the work that you do. One of the things that's unique, maybe not unique, but I think specific about Georgetown's history with slavery is how well the Jesuits kept records. And this is part of the reason why we were able to find the descendants of the 272, because there was such fine record keeping. But with the history of slavery more generally, there's often gaps in the archive. So I wonder if we could build on this thread a little bit around different modes of information transmission over generations. And you could talk some about how your work draws from or doesn't draw from the archive. Anita, would you start, please?
Sure, I think it's really an interesting question. I've recently done this so one side of my family is very well documented, their relationship to slavery, and that's the Lawrence, South Carolina side, which also includes a lot of preachers. In fact, my grandfather was a presiding elder in Washington, D.C., AME. But in that side of the family, it's very well documented, both through word of mouth and of course through the digital tools we have. So I know exactly kind of which plantation in Lawrence people came from and what the history of ministry was, because of course within enslavement cultures, the church was a place where people kept both social activism and storytelling. I mean, I really resonate with this idea of storytelling. On the other side of my family, which is the Caribbean side, I've been going back to the Bahamas to try to taste the history. And that's where histories of slavery become really interesting, because the Bahamas were, the enslaved were released from slavery in 1838. And we've traced all the way back to a parcel of slaves that came from Cat Island, which is an out island, to Eleuthera, which was a port for transporting newly freed workers out to like Key West and to Florida. So like, but finding the records, you have to think of yourselves as property, because that's what slavery was. So there's all these parcels. We know that there was a parcel, and in that particular parcel that was shipped out from Cat Island, there was a child a woman who was 18 who had a mixed race child who was 2, right? So you're looking at both how rape and sexual violence was happening on the plantation, as well as how people were trying to find a place for themselves in the world of the newly released from slavery. And so it's through that trajectory within my family that I can very clearly trace how they went from out island to port to Key West, where of course the only skills they were able to use were working as domestics. It's an interest. I'm sure it's similar to a New Orleans story where you have all these different multicultural communities living side by side in the early 19th century. But everyone is suffering from this legacy of slavery that happened through their family.
Right. The comment about where to look in the archive reminds me of how instructive Saidiya Hartman's work is, and asking us to rethink about our engagement with the archive and where to look and how we might find different stories. Melly, I was struck by your earlier point that you already had this story before you came to Georgetown. So I'm curious with Here I Am, how much you engage with the archive, if at all, Georgetown's archive around the 272, and how much you were drawing from your own stories that you had known throughout your life.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I had an oral history. I had a family knowledge. I knew everything about my family in Louisiana from 1838 to 2016. I also had the oral history of my family originating in Maryland as a part of our history. The internal slave trade, the American internal slave trade, is very different from the transatlantic slave trade. Many Black families were moved from the upper South to the lower South. In Louisiana, there was a particular method of record keeping that was not required in other states because we have complicated inheritance laws. One of the things about the Jesuits, they didn't keep great records. They kept some records. They kept the records that they wanted to keep. So you may find occasional references to enslaved people, but you gotta go through a lot of reading and paperwork. So who are those people who do that? They are the academics and people who are interested in advancing their academic careers by doing this research. And it becomes proprietary because you put in the time to do that work to advance you to where you need to go. So the question is, how do we take that information and bring it to the people who have the least access to it? How do we engage the public in the public history and the storytelling that is not the mythologized and or convenient histories that we continue to engage in, and certainly not lost cause narratives? So I charge institutions of higher learning that were in existence prior to the Civil War, who all benefited from enslavement, and those institutions that, after enslavement, educated the people who went out and made the laws for Americans to be disenfranchised and continue to do so today. So institutions of higher learning should be charged with correcting the knowledge and the information that you have passed on that sends people out into medical professions, legal professions, economic professions, lawmakers, presidents, who actually continue to go about the business of state-sanctioned disenfranchisement.
No, Melanie, there's several things we could pick up on what you said, but two things that I wanted to highlight were, one, your point about inheritance. It's interesting looking at inheritance laws in the US, particularly in the 19th century, because it's one space where American capitalism and investment in instantiating that in the law butts up against racial capitalism, right? And so that there's all this wrangling about whether or not children who are from enslaved women and white men can inherit. There's all this wrangling in the law actually over that, because the US wants to uphold inheritance laws because it's the bedrock of how capitalism flows, while at the same time, they want to uphold Black people as property. And so you see this back and forth. So I appreciate that point. And then the other piece around accessing archives, because even if you have an archive that is purportedly open to the public, who has the time and knows the protocols of engaging with the archive to access the information? And then of course, how the archive is organized is invested in a certain mode of knowledge production, a certain way of getting at things that you may or may not know those protocols again. And so even though it may be open to the public, what publics actually are able to make use of that information. Carlos, could you talk some about your work with the Requiem, and again, how much of it you drew from archives, or where you drew the information for it from?
Sure. Well, I'm a musician, and so I believe if you take the word music, it's like the muses are speaking to me, and so I approach each piece that I write with this mindset, like there's something higher at play here, and for this piece, it's been the ancestors. They've been with me, and I feel from the very beginning, sort of helping me to kind of get to this place of telling the story, helping. And so when I first came to campus, Professor Adam Rothman, he showed me to the archives, and it was so much in there. It's a wellspring of just knowledge there. And we spent, several hours just kind of mining those archives. But the bill of sale really is one that stood out to me. And I actually begin the piece as an invocation, speaking the names, the names of those enslaved. And in a way, it's evoking, it's pulling their names off the page and evoking their spirits. And I'm writing music that it's traveling music. I like to think of it as, the actual bill of sale, it has their names, age, and then every now and then it says like Isaac's son, or ran away. There's so much in that, and I choosing to kind of take time with that. Ran away. Isaac's son ran away. It's so much power, and it really is telling a story just in those two phrases. And music is there to kind of as glue and sort of holding things together. And I'm this whole project it's holistic in a way, and I'm just trying to be as free as a conduit as I can.
Yes, Anita, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to the notion of archives that have come up both times, because it's easy for academics to think of archives as the material evidence. But because I come from the field of dance and performance, there's also an archive of human and embodied memory. That's the archive I work from most often. So when I do try to create a play or a project based upon an archive, it's just as valid to take a piece of archival material, much as Carlos has talked about, put it in the middle of a circle of people, and then to see what kind of stories emerge from their engagement with that archive, with that material element through their own personal experiences, especially if there's people of color. So I'm really committed to the idea of letting the archive grow from the material evidence and be siphoned through the psyche and also the actual lived experiences of the people who are in the circle creating the work.
And, expanding what we mean by archive, again, this goes back to, I guess this takes on a different angle of Melly's point around access and inclusion in terms of who has access to different forms of knowledge, and to the point around, drawing from here I am from storytelling, and then engaging with some of the physical objects that the Jesuits have collected over the years, and the tension between those two stories about the 272. So I appreciate that context for thinking about archives, Anita, because it really draws attention to how all of your work is pulling from multiple sources of information to create new stories in the world. Yes, Mel.
And I think I'd like to also form the idea of archival research around whose stories are we reading, and through whose lens was this archive created? Because it certainly wasn't created through the lens or for the enslaved people. They were subjects. They were not equal citizens with equal rights to tell their stories. And Catholics didn't trade or sell slaves to Baptists because they didn't want Catholic slaves. Catholics wanted Catholic slaves. And from 1639, when the Jesuits arrived here, they were the representatives of the Catholic Church and the builders of Catholicism in the United States of America. And Catholicism, as we know it, spread out with Jesuit priests and Black enslaved Catholics across America who built the edifice physically of what Jesuit education represents in America today.
Right, the history resonates with the book Ebony and Ivory, Craig Wilder, where he talks about, he doesn't talk about Georgetown specifically, but it's a similar history. I remember in the passage around Princeton, he talks about students bringing their enslaved with them to the university to support them, to serve them while they were students there. And so both the groundskeepers, the people who are building the physical infrastructure of the universities, as well as continuing to support the students while they were there. I want to return to the question of sort of the central contradiction at the heart of the history of Georgetown and Jesuit institutions and slavery. But before we go down that path, there's a question from the audience that asks, Anita and Melly, what are your hopes for future theater art projects coming out of the US? I wonder if this question is specifically around future art projects as they pertain to slavery or more broadly. And I wonder if we can answer that question in relationship to a question that I have, which is, are there any pieces of art that have inspired you as you were creating your own work, or ones that you think are really important for us to be paying attention to in this moment?
I think life is art. And I think moments can be captured from the past in the present that will affect the future. So in many cosmologies around the world, we human beings are seen as the bridge between the dead and the unborn. So we have to do our work here. And our work is to be of service to other human beings, and each one teach one. So the stories of my grandmother and my great-grandmother and their lives and my life and our lives can be art if that is how we frame what we are giving.
The idea of being a bridge is so powerful because it moves beyond the individual extractive mode of slavery and capitalism and allows us to think about systems of relation. Carlos or Anita, are there any works that you found particularly inspiring as you creating your own works, or things that you're looking forward to that are on the landscape?
Well, I have both. Things that have inspired me are like Kara Walker's Silhouettes, because they abstract the experience of slavery while still presenting its violence in Black and white. I'm about to direct another version of Robbie McCauley's Sally's Rape, which is two women in conversation in the contemporary times about what it means to have a history of slavery and how that influences the very relationship that you can have with a white person now, because you're carrying in your body different kinds of legacies of histories, so that if you were to appear on a platform or a stage naked, people would see you differently because of the histories around enslavement. And then the histories that I am most invested in doing and also would like to see is slavery in many contexts. I mean, slavery didn't just happen in the United States, it happened in Brazil, it happened in Cuba. I've created some work about Liverpool, which is where they benefited, where many of the financial benefits of slavery remained in Liverpool. They were the people who financed the slave trade without actually having to do the dirty work. And yet, so they are part of the reason why we have so much enslavement happening in the British Caribbean. And it's like a circuit that goes from England to Africa, to the Caribbean, to the United States. So I'm interested in how that kind of global circulation of slavery as an institution has impact, and as a capitalist system, has impacted people in many different countries. I think there are more cross sections and interrelationships than we talk about, because people moved around that circuit whenever they could, both enslaved and freed. So that's kind of the kind of stories I want to see. I want to see it expanded a little further, and I try to work towards that in musical writing, in writing for the musical stage.
Thank you. We're joined by Nicole Slater. We're so happy to, Salter, excuse me. We're so happy to have you. And we are thinking through together now if there are any works that have inspired you and or that you are excited about that are on the horizon that have to do with the engagement with slavery. And I think that Carlos was getting ready to answer, so maybe you could take a few minutes to think if you have a response to that question, but welcome, we're so happy to have you. Carlos, are there any works you would want to point to?
Yeah, sure. Using this form of the Requiem, I wanted to really do my research and understanding how other composers were using the Requiem. This is a very traditional art form, so you typically it's like large orchestra with a choir and like vocal soloists. That's not at all what I wanted to do, and I wanted to keep this as intimate and as possible. So you're using a spoken word artist, Marco Pave, Georgetown's artist in residence, and we're using a small group of musicians to including me. I'll be playing piano to give the music. But I mentioned the composers who've used the Requiem, but also Blood on the Fields by Wynton Marsalis. It has the same sort of premises of using music to talk about not only slavery, but also the after effects of slavery. Wynton Marsalis, his music is based in jazz and improvisation. And it's something I want to, I'm using in my piece as well as traditional Western art forms.
I want to say that I've had the gift of hearing snippets of the Requiem, and I've been blown away. So you have the opportunity to hear it, I strongly encourage it. It's powerful. So again, we are joined by Nicole Salter, an award-winning actress, playwright, educator, and advocate of Obie Award-winning, Outer Critics Circle Award-winning. Thank you so much for joining us, and also collaborated on Here I Am. Again, I wonder if there are any pieces that have inspired you as you are creating your own work in terms of slavery and its afterlives, and or works that you're excited about that are on the horizon.
I hate to join late, and I also want to say, gosh, my apologies. I was scheduled to take a COVID test that went a little left, so it ran a little long. And I thank you for welcoming me here, despite my tardiness. And to respond to your question, works. Well, I also hate to join late and promote my own work, but I'm actually pretty excited about a play I wrote called Torn Asunder, which was a commission by historian Heather Williams, who was then at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has since moved on to UPenn or Penn State. I get them confused. I know they're different. I think it's UPenn. Her body of work was largely about the African American family post-emancipation. And she wrote a lovely book called Help Me to Find My People that she wanted to extend its reach in terms of audience. And so she commissioned me with Kathy A. Perkins to write a play about it. And I think looking at slavery through the lens of family, not through the lens of politics or necessarily even of slavery, where slavery becomes the given circumstance of the family trying to stay together. You actually learn a lot, but still remain engaged in the power of the story of the human connection. So I'm pretty psyched about that. But there's also work coming that's informed aesthetically from the experience, I believe, of slavery and its connection to West African roots by playwright Sangu Njakam. And I'm really excited about the work that he's doing, which I believe is on the horizon at the Apollo Theater. So keep a lookout.
Thank you. And I also appreciate you offering up some of your work, because we began by each of our panelists describing how their work intersected with slavery. So our audience got a 2-for-1 with that answer.
Excellent.
I want to return to a point that Melly made earlier about the Jesuits' involvement with slavery and sort of the legacy and responsibility that history entails. When Georgetown began to engage with that history in earnest, circa 2016, one of the, and this is detailed in Here I Am, but one of the outcomes of that engagement was having a prayer service of reconciliation. And it was in some ways trying to come to terms with the responsibility and the legacy and its implications in terms of the Catholic faith more specifically. I wonder if you could talk some about what is the responsibility for the artist more generally in terms of handling preciously the legacies of traumatic past, and how the artists might intercede in that work of engaging with traumatic past. And I think some about how this session fits into a larger conference around the history and legacies of slavery, and us thinking specifically about the work of artists. And so what do you think the role and responsibilities of the artists are in engaging with these histories and these legacies? Anita?
Tag. So I think it's a way of coping with trauma. I think for artists themselves, it's a way of coping with trauma and a way of finding healing with each other. So, I mean, I think that, I was looking at the sidebar question about the responsibility for Black arts. I think it's a different responsibility for people who have been harmed by the experience, in the way that you can use collective art making as a way of coping with histories and trauma, and also finding joy that helps you to supersede histories of trauma. It's really important to do both. And I think that it's hard for me to separate that from thinking about Black arts traditions generally, because people always have been coping with trauma, right? And finding joy with trauma, and then also like reliving trauma. I think about the work about the lynching plays, how they, and many of which happened in Washington, of course, where people would come together to talk about histories of lynching as a way of just coping with their own trauma around the ongoing onslaught, right? And at the same time, those same groups of playwrights produced comedies, right? So you could also find ways to vent. And in my personal work, I like to bring together communities together around the art. We talked about the archive, around the archive, to be able to see what kind of histories come out of that. In terms of people, non-Black people, the global minority people who are non-Black, I think that it's important. Everybody should be engaged with Blackness. They always were. So why wouldn't they be engaged now with reliving those histories of Blackness with the people who were sitting at the center of that experience?
Thank you. I often like to say that too. When people say minority, I say, oh, you mean the global majority. But alas, that's not where we're going. Melly, your thoughts on what the responsibility of the artists are in terms of dealing with traumatic past?
Well, honestly, the traumatic past is the past. I'm traumatized this morning. I'm traumatized yesterday. I was traumatized. I have been consistently and repeatedly traumatized in my lifetime. So, yes, I have a traumatized DNA and a long history of traumatic experience as an American from the very beginnings in a colonial experience. That is part of the story of my family's existence. And the institutional microcosmic look at Georgetown is a look at the broader way that slavery became entrenched in America, and that discrimination and racism has continued to present face forward today, 2021. So my trauma is actually, my personal trauma is from my personal life. And the knowledge that 11, 12 generations of my family have survived the extreme circumstances pressed upon them through their existence in this place has brought me to today. That is a liberatory and joyous feeling for me because I'm here. It took a whole lot to get me here. And because I am here, this is what I do.
I had a really powerful conversation with an artist who, in relationship to a play by a brilliant playwright named Erica Dickerson Dispenza, and the play is about Katrina. And one of the things that she corrected me, which was very helpful, is that she noted that the survivors of Katrina weren't victims, but rather they were witnesses to what America had done. And so I think, to your point, thinking about the mechanisms of survival that have sustained Black people in the diaspora all this time is an important redirection of thinking about the past and how we might understand the past. Nicole, what is the role of the artist?
Yeah, I think the artist has two powers. The power to reflect with honesty, and the power to influence through transformation. And so when I think about what our responsibility is, I feel as though there's been a grand effort to reflect and correct the narrative, an effort to create a new meaning and a new sense of identity that's not burdened by the stereotypical narratives that have been used to contain and diminish us. But I am also excited by the new push to look at how we transform the energy that we have received and inherited into what we would like to become, into influence people to think about their power to actually transform and create their own narrative and to use the narrative as the organizing principle of their transformation. So when I think about with respect to slavery, I think that the lens through which we look at it is always being examined by the artists of my community, and ways in which that can become a positive tool in the direction of the path of empowerment and enlightenment and stepping into our truth. So that's what I think the artist has the power to do.
Thank you. And finally, Carlos, I mean, in rereading your bios this morning, I was struck by the ongoing presentness of elegy. Not that you need to speak to that piece, but just to Melly's point around both, longer histories, but then our very present history of racialized violence and trauma. What is the role of the artist?
Yeah, well, I like to think, I like to adopt Nina Simone's ideology. It's that art should reflect our time. And I think, yeah, it's being able to tell these stories and to honor our present as well as our past. With this project, I'm choosing not to go the traumatic route of putting the audience through trauma. It's this project is not about that. It's about honoring the legacy of those enslaved, and it's that I think trauma in a way I don't have permission to do that with this particular project, and that's what I feel about it. With Elegy, which honored is dedicated to Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. I wrote that piece in 2014, and since then the list has grown. It seems like every day now of those murdered, by police, and so I wrote it for me, honestly, because I was scared, I was afraid and frustrated, and I needed music to kind of as an outlet to express these feelings. So I mean, it just kind of goes to show you every piece is different for me, and the approach is always different.
Yeah. Well, I could talk to you all afternoon, but we are running up against time. Before we go, your audience has been inspired by you and wants to know where they can follow you to hear more about your work. So quickly, could we just go around and say for, more work soon where folks can go?
Sure. I encourage everybody to follow the Laboratory for Global Politics and Performance at Georgetown University and the Department for Theater and Performance. This is where, and Carlos, and follow our arts program at Georgetown, because this is where our work is happening now. And I think Georgetown has presented itself in a leadership position, and we're all hoping to be part of the change we want to see in the world.
Thank you. Anyone else? Places to look? Yes. Carlos?
Yeah, you could follow me on my website, coliversimon.com, as well as my Instagram page, Simon Composer.
Anita or Nicole?
www.anitagonzalez.com, and also _ following at Georgetown. Let's see what we do with the Racial Justice Institute. That's where we can follow us.
Nicole?
I also amplify following the lab and all of these wonderful artists. If you want to check me out, you can follow me at NicoleSalter.com. or at my handle of all of the social media platforms, Nicole Salter. Very simple.
Well, again, I want to thank our guests. I'm so excited that Georgetown's work around racial justice is centering the arts. You can see that from this conversation and also the future work that is being planned. So please keep an eye out for that. Please go and see Here I Am and follow the work of all of our guests today. Thank you again for spending some time with us and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye-bye.